In 1980, the entire skateboard industry was nearly dead. The big skate parks that had opened in the late 70s were closing one after another, sued out of existence by their own insurance companies. Skateboard sales were a fraction of what they had been just a few years earlier. The whole thing looked finished. And then, out of garages in Santa Barbara, factories in Santa Cruz, and warehouses in Southern California, a generation of skaters started building decks themselves, started filming each other on Super 8 cameras, and started shipping their work to skate shops in Texas and Florida and Britain and Germany. What happened over the next 10 years is one of the strangest comeback stories in American sports history. The skateboard brands of the 1980s did not just sell decks. They built an entire subculture, an entire visual language, an entire generation of kids who would never look at a flat piece of pavement the same way again. Here are the brands that did it. The story really starts at a wooden building in Santa Barbara, California, where a man named George Powell teamed up with Stacy Peralta in 1978 to launch a small skateboard company called Powell Peralta. By 1981, they had assembled a team of riders that would change everything. They called it the Bones Brigade. Tony Hawk, Lance Mountain, Steve Caballero, Mike McGill, Rodney Mullen, Tommy Guerrero, 6 teenagers who would become household names in skate culture. The Powell Peralta decks from this era are the most recognizable skateboard graphics in history. The Steve Caballero Dragon and Bat deck, the Tony Hawk Iron Cross deck, the Mike McGill Skull and Snake deck, the Rodney Mullen Mutt deck, the Lance Mountain Future Primitive deck. These graphics by Vernon Cortland Johnson became the visual language of an entire generation. A clean shrink-wrapped original Steve Caballero Dragon deck now sells for between $5,000 and $8,000 on the vintage skate market. The Bones Brigade videotapes that Stacy Peralta produced, especially The Search for Animal Chin from 1987, are now considered some of the most influential sports films ever made. But Powell Peralta did not have the 80s to themselves. 250 miles north, in Santa Cruz, California, a company called Santa Cruz Skateboards was building decks that competed for every wall in every skate shop in America. Santa Cruz had the artist who would become as legendary as Vernon Cortland Johnson. His name was Jim Phillips, and his graphics changed what skateboard art could be. The Santa Cruz Screaming Hand, the Rob Roscop Face deck, the Jeff Kendall Pumpkin deck, the Jason Jesse Neptune deck, the Salba Witch Doctor deck. These graphics are now on t-shirts in every Urban Outfitters in America, and the original decks from the 80s sell for thousands of dollars to collectors who remember them from skate magazine pages. Santa Cruz also launched a wheel brand called OJ Wheels, and a sister company called Slime Balls Wheels that became standard equipment on half the skateboards in America. Vision Skateboards, founded by Brad Dorfman in Costa Mesa, California, became the third pillar of the early 80s scene. Vision built decks for Mark Gonzalez, the street skating pioneer who would change the direction of the entire sport in the late 80s. The Mark Gonzalez color deck from 1984, with the bird and the colorful figures, is now one of the most collected skateboard decks in vintage history. Vision also produced decks for Mark Mountain and the Visionwear clothing line that became as iconic as the decks themselves. The Vision streetwear high tops with the white logo became a fashion staple of the late 80s that has been re-released multiple times to massive nostalgia-driven demand. Now we need to talk about the founding fathers. 3 brands that built the entire skateboard industry before Powell Peralta and Santa Cruz arrived. Sims Skateboards, founded by Tom Sims in California in the 70s, and ran through the 80s with the freestyle decks that taught kids in suburban driveways how to skate flat ground. The Sims Brad Bowman deck and the Sims Kevin Stab deck became standard issue in skate parks across the country. Alva Skates, founded by Tony Alva in 1977, absolutely defining the rebellious side of skating through the entire 80s. The Alva decks were dark, aggressive, with skull graphics and a punk attitude that made them the deck of choice for the angriest kids in any neighborhood. G&S, which stands for Gordon and Smith, was the San Diego company that became the elder statesman of the skate world. The G&S Neil Blender Coffee Break deck and the G&S Pierre Andre deck were the decks of the most progressive and artistic skaters of the early 80s. If you are enjoying this trip through the skate brands that built our childhoods, hit subscribe. We are covering every iconic piece of 1980s culture week by week. Now let us get to the brands that came up alongside the giants and changed the game. Madrid Skateboards was the brand that anyone who watched Back to the Future could not forget. The pink Madrid deck that Marty McFly rode through the parking lot in 1985 became one of the most iconic skateboard appearances in any movie in American history. Madrid built decks throughout the entire decade, and the Madrid Mike Smith deck and the Madrid Eddie Radigi deck are still collected today. Veriflex skateboards became the brand of the more affordable end of the market, with decks sold in larger numbers and prices that allowed thousands of kids who could not afford a Powell Peralta to get into skateboarding. The Veriflex Alan Lucy deck and the Veriflex Eric Grisham deck were the entry points for an entire generation of skate park riders. Then came the boutique brands that defined the back half of the decade. Schmidt Sticks, founded by Paul Schmidt in 1983, became the brand of the more progressive technical skaters. The Schmidt Sticks John Lucero deck, the Schmidt Sticks Chris Miller deck, and the Schmidt Sticks Joe Lopes deck were the decks of the new generation of vert skaters who came up after the Bones Brigade. Paul Schmidt would later go on to become arguably the most influential skateboard manufacturer in history, but Schmidt Sticks in the mid-80s is where his story really started. Hosoi Skates, founded by Christian Hosoi, became the direct artistic and athletic competitor to Tony Hawk's Powell Peralta empire. Christian Hosoi was the most beautiful skater of the decade to watch, and his Hosoi Hammerhead deck, with the unique cutout tail design, is one of the most photographed skateboard decks ever produced. The 80s were not just about decks. The components mattered just as much. Tracker trucks, made in Oceanside, California, became the official truck of the first half of the decade, with the Tracker Magnesium and the Tracker 6-track ridden by half the pro skaters in the industry. Then in the mid-80s, a small truck company called Independent Trucks out of San Francisco took over completely. The Independent Stage 3 trucks became the absolute standard for street and vert skating, and to this day, Independent is still the most ridden truck brand in skateboarding. Bones wheels, the wheel brand from George Powell, became the standard wheel for any serious skater. The Bones Cubics and the Bones Hot Tracks wheels were as essential to a complete skateboard as the deck on top. And the Vans shoe brand, which had been making canvas slip-ons for surfers in Anaheim since the 60s, exploded in the 80s as the skate shoe of choice for every kid in every neighborhood. Now we have to talk about what happened at the end of the decade, because that is when the entire industry changed forever. In 1987, a company called World Industries was founded by Steve Rocco and Rodney Mullen, two former Powell Peralta riders who wanted to build a brand that reflected the street skating revolution that was happening in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. World Industries blew up the rules of skateboard art and skateboard marketing. The decks had cartoon graphics that mocked the entire skateboard establishment. The advertising was angry, sarcastic, and aimed directly at the next generation. World Industries would launch a whole family of brands in the early 90s, including Plan B, Blind, and Black Label, and the entire post-80s skateboard industry was essentially built on the foundation that World laid in 1987 and 88. The shift from vert skating to street skating, from skate parks to handrails, from skull graphics to cartoon graphics, all of it happened in those last 2 years of the 80s, and the brands that did not adapt to it would die in the early 90s. So why are these brands now selling decks for thousands of dollars? Because what happened in skateboarding between 1980 and 1989 was completely unrepeatable. The artists were in their prime. Vernon Cortland Johnson at Powell Peralta, Jim Phillips at Santa Cruz, the hand-pulled silk screens, the Super 8 skate videos, the skate magazines like Thrasher and Transworld, printing on newsprint with full-color centerfolds. The whole thing was a moment that has been mythologized into the foundational mythology of American skateboarding. Every modern skate brand owes a creative debt to one of these companies. Every modern skate graphic borrows visual ideas from Jim Phillips or VCJ. Every modern street skating brand is descended from what World Industries broke open in 1987, and the prices show it. A sealed original Powell Peralta Mike McGill skull and snake deck now sells for over $6,000 on the vintage skate market. A clean Santa Cruz Jason Jesse Neptune deck sells for around $2,000. A complete Madrid Pink McFly deck from 1985 sells for prices that would buy a used car. The Bones Brigade videos on original VHS tapes now sell for hundreds of dollars sealed. The Vision Streetwear high tops, the original Vans slip-ons, the Independent Trucks t-shirts, all of it now lives on Grailed and eBay at prices that make perfect sense to the people who lived through that era and complete nonsense to everyone else. So tell us in the comments, which one of these brands defined your skate childhood? Were you a Powell Peralta kid riding a Tony Hawk deck and dreaming about a McTwist? A Santa Cruz kid with a Rob Roscop under your feet and a Jim Phillips t-shirt on your back? An Alva kid with the skull graphics and the punk attitude? Or were you a Vision kid riding a Mark Gonzalez deck and trying to street skate before street skating was even a thing? If you enjoyed this trip back to the founding era of American skateboarding, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We are working through every iconic piece of 1980s culture, one video at a time. And if you have one of these decks in your closet right now, do yourself a favor and look up what it is worth before you flip it for $20 at a yard sale.